Welcome back to the channel, folks, and to another tutorial. This one's not a painting tutorial as such, rather it's a basing tutorial to go with the Japanese that I recently published. And if you want to see how I painted the Japanese infantry, then check the link in the description below. Now there's lots of really nice Japanese base projects going out across social media just now using all sorts of basing. A lot of it is 3D printed elements, resin elements, and what I'm going to do is show you how you can get nice jungle or Southeast Asian themed bases without using these 3D printed or resin parts that either are inaccessible for you, or maybe you feel they're a bit too brittle and are worried about breaking them when you're picking up the bases. So I'm going to show you how, using the kind of elements that you're going to have in your terrain box and also things you can find lying about outside in the street, that you can get some lovely looking jungle bases. I'm going to show you three different types of bases that I've made for this project, and they're different for a couple of reasons. First of all, for a bit of variety, but secondly, to keep the platoons distinct, looking like they're from a combined unit, but they are at least distinctive and easily distinguishable upon the tabletop. I'm going to start with the jungle themed bases before I move on to the dry and dusty paddy fields. The two different types of jungle basing that I'll be doing is dry jungle with dark foliage, and then a bit of a swampy jungle with dark and light foliage for a bit of variety. You can see they really stand out differently against each other, but they're basically the same approach for both. And you've probably picked up on the fact that the trees that I've used here are actually just twigs. Now, I've used twigs in quite a lot of my projects before. I feel they make very good trees because they're part of trees, and probably for most people, unless you're in a very built up area, it's very easy to find these scattered around. We had two storms this winter, so out in the front of my house is absolutely covered with little broken bits of twig that have been blown down from the trees. Now, you have to consider the size of twig that you're collecting. It can't be too big and it also can't be too thin. Bring them home and let them dry out naturally. They probably have a little bit of moisture even if it is dry outside, and pick up clean ones if at all possible. Pick them up off grass rather than off dirt, and the best solution is if there is a branch that's snapped off and it's not touched the ground, then break them off of that. I got most of what I needed from such a branch that I found when I was out walking the dog. So now I've selected the branches, I'm going to start cutting them to size. I'm looking for maybe about a 1 inch height. We don't want them too big because I've got to remember storage. And if you use foam trays, for instance, well, make sure you get the right depth to fit in the foam trays. They don't have to be tall to get the jungle look. They just have to be there to provide the impression of trees. I'm going to need about 4 or 5 of these for every base. I'm not concerned about finding twigs that have got lots of little branchings. It's not important. We're going to be adding foliage, that's the most important thing, and we're going to be placing the branches onto the bases in such a way that the foliage is going to have plenty to glue onto. Now, I'm going to attach them to the plastic base before the ground cover is applied. That ground cover on top of the hot melt glue that I'm using here will give them the best possible bond. When I'm gluing these sections of branch, I'm going to bear in mind how the foliage is going to get glued in, and also how a large extent that you will see little trees growing, for instance in the jungle or in woods where they're in little clumps. So you can see there a group of 3. Foliage can get glued into that group and it will hold it nice and strong. Then we can do groups of 2 and the occasional one all by itself. Variety will help here in the overall look, and also just bear in mind where the infantry are on the base and how the final setup will be, the feeling of movement through the wood, and also where there's going to be, for instance, tufts and other foliage attached to the floor of the base. And the good thing about the hot melt glue is it dries very, very quick, so that we can move on to the next stage, which is getting the ground cover down. For the dry jungle bases, I'm going to be using this Vallejo product here. It's very good for basing in general terms. Normally when I'm basing, I would not have trees and such like on the base. I would have the flat base I would cover the whole thing in this basing material and then push the figures straight in, which spoils out the excess material from the circular holes, which can then be levelled out and pushed into the spaces between the legs and so on, and it takes no time at all. Doing it with this jungle look though is quite tricky, and it takes a little bit of patience. I'm using a cocktail stick instead of a larger tool to start pushing the material into and around the figures, the trees, their legs and so on. So got to be careful. If you make a mistake and get any material onto the trees and you don't want it there, or onto the figures, then a brush with a little bit of water will wipe it off. Just remove it straight away and it's not going to be noticeable at all. This paste is really quite thick, but you may find, depending on the exact size of each of the individual figure bases, that you need to go back once it's dry the next day and do a little bit of filling. It's not so much of a problem if you're going to be covering that in flock, for instance, but we're not going to be doing that here. Now there's one more element that I'm going to add to the wet jungle before I put the base material down, and that's some tufts. I'm going to use this to sort of represent reeds growing out of the marshy ground, and for that I'm going to use a good old welcome mat and just cut it up very carefully. You notice I've got a nice solid metal base there as well. Catches all the little bits of mat that fall off and also protects your tabletop, and then just start carefully cutting into it, trimming back the little base that you can see, the little bit of rubber, so that it's got the smallest profile as possible for when I'm then put it down and attach it to the base itself. I'm going to be using this welcome mat material too for the paddy fields, but in a slightly different way, as you'll see. After I glued those little welcome mat tufts into place, I applied a coat of mud basing colour, so a mud paste. It's nice and shiny, so it's going to give that wet look that we're after. Leave it to dry, because then the next day I'm going to go in with the dry basing material, use that as a filler around the feet and the bases of the figures that are on there and around the tufts, because the muddy paste is really quite thin. And it'll also help just get a bit of variety, a bit of a mixture of slightly higher dry ground and then the rest of the slightly lower ground being wetter and muddy. And once again, by piling up the thicker, heavier basing material around all the little twigs, it'll help maintain the bond between them and the base. And here is that shiny mud product that I'm using for the jungle bases. Now the dry basing material, it works quite well by itself. You don't have to add too much to it, you don't have to paint it, but I like to get it looking a little bit more earthy by applying some pigments. Now I'm going to be using a light earth kind of pigment. I think this is dry mud pigment here, and I'm just going to mix it up on a palette, as you can see, and then apply it to the bases. Now it's very important that you do not use too much pigment when you're doing this, otherwise it's going to completely dominate. You might want it to completely dominate, but then you're doing what you intend rather than accidentally slapping on pigment. Pigment is a kind of product that when you apply it, it looks as though there's nothing really there, but there is in fact a hell of a lot there, and you can only tell until it's dry. So mix up a bit in a palette, apply it, let it dry, and then add more if you need it. Now I just mix it with water. There's no need to do anything more complicated than that. You don't have to use pigment fixers or anything. It's going to sit on the base quite nicely. The only way it's going to get removed, especially after varnishing, is if the surface itself is removed. So I'm going to apply this to the dry and dusty paddy fields and to the dry jungle bases, and I'm going to use a different colour for the swampy jungle bases. And there is a dark earth pigment on the palette. I'm going to apply this to the Villaggio paste that I've put onto the bases, not to the areas that are covered in the shiny muddy base, because if I do that it will become quite matte and I want that shiny muddy look. The other areas though, I don't want them just that raw base material. This dark brown pigment will keep it in the same theme for the rest of the base, give it a bit of an earthy look, like a bit more of a dry area around all the muddy and wet areas, and help just bring it all together and keep it in theme. to have lost the video footage of actually attaching all the foliage, all the green stuff and everything, folks, so I'm just going to quickly recap it. You don't really need to see me gluing things in place, it's more about what I've used and why. So first of all, we've got for foliage, got this kind of stuff here. This is from Mini Nature and I get it from, let me think, warbases.co.uk. They're a local business to me as well, but you can get this kind of stuff from lots of different suppliers, but Mini Nature, that's not got an E on the end. Actually, hold on a minute. Now you can see the packet there if you want to try and source them from somewhere else. I think the sort of railway modelling kind of product, and they do tons of different stuff. There's a different style of foliage as well as tufts and things, but there's so many of these kind of products out there. The choice is yours. So you can see here on the, I'll bring it a bit closer, try and keep it in the light. On the dry jungle bases, you can see I have put the lengths of foliage, that's the stuff, into the twigs and glued them in place, and so they're getting multiple points on which they can glue. That's the optimal situation. And then we've got various other kind of tufts, and this is just me going through my supplies and seeing what I had, and that would work just as well for you folks. Just try and get a bit of variety in there. It just helps draw the eye, focus the eye. If it's all the same colour, it kind of becomes a bit of a blur. But that's the dry jungle bases. And then for the wet jungle bases, I've used similar approach again to how I fitted the foliage in place. That one there you can see is glued just to one. Bring it a bit closer, just to the one twig, but that works just as well. Glue at the bottom, glue at the top. You can see the little tufts, or rather sort of like standing reeds and so on that we got from the welcome mat. And then I've used some flock here, not static grass but flock. Now that's for just kind of like a sort of scummy growth across the surface rather than grass. I've not used any grass at all in these. Most jungle is not got grass in it, you know, it's got ground cover, which to a large extent is going to be dry leaf litter and such likes, but this is swampy, so a little bit of growth on the surface, you know, sort of pond-like greenery, and then just different kinds of tufts. Got, let me see, this type here, which is got little speckles of colour in it. I've used that on that one just to get it different from the dry ones, and I'll show you in a minute. Let me see, let's see, there you go, there's different colour of the foliage, so that you end up with two platoons, if I can avoid making a mess, two platoons that are more or less the same but look sufficiently different so you can tell them apart, but they've still got that jungle theme. As well as jungle, you will also see paddy fields all over the Pacific Theatre, so I've not seen anybody try any of these, so I thought it would be good not only to help distinguish the platoons, instead of having three different types of jungle, have two jungle and one paddy field, and also just to show you as an option something that you could do for Pacific that doesn't rely on foliage and such likes. So to begin with, I had to think about where the banks of the paddy fields were going to go, so I put all the bases together and I drew a few lines on them. I wasn't trying to storyboard these because paddy fields are really quite big, and you not necessarily want to create internal shapes of paddy fields within the platoon. It's more just about making sure that there's a right balance across the platoon and that you can get the bases into the paddy fields and not worry about the banks getting in the way of placement. Now what you can see me doing here is adding the cover material, the Villagio paste, the thick paste, not the thin muddy paste. But before then, what I have done is glued all of the individual figures into their holes, and then using milliput I have put down some very simple, as you can see, very simple shapes of the paddy field banks. As part of my planning process, I noticed there were some of the figures that needed to be a little bit further apart to get the bank through where I wanted it to go, and I clipped off little bits off the bases so that I could push them further away. So if you imagine, I'm clipping off the side of the base that is on the opposite side of where the bank's going to go, so I can push the figure further away from where the bank will be placed. The milliput will need to be left overnight to set, and then the following day we can go in with the paste, start filling in around the bases themselves, the bases of the figures that is, and then working over the banks. Now try to keep everything quite smooth. It can be tricky, especially when you're working on the side of a bank where a figure is quite close to it. So use smaller items such as cocktail sticks, as well as the sort of sculpting tool that I'm using there. And a combination of tools, I suppose an age-old thing, the right tool for the right job will get it done. And I should say that the size of the banks is very important. They can't be too small or they're not going to be visible really. And also they can't be too tall, because then they'll be too visible and unrealistic. So you can see here it's roughly sort of just below knee height, maybe call it shin height. So leave that paste to dry overnight. There's a lot of this overnight drying in this whole basing process, folks. You might not do a lot of hours work each day, but it could take several days to finish the project. And now what I'm doing is adding some sort of remaining dry rice stalks. I've got the good old welcome mat out again, and I'm going to be cutting sections and then trimming them down, as you can see here. I'll speed this up a bit just so you can see the full process. Now I am sort of selecting a little lump of the mat material. It tends to be glued into place in lumps, so that makes it quite easy for you. And I'm going to hold it in place and snip it off, and then putting the glue directly to that clump that I'm holding tightly together, I will then add it to the base, and that works really quite well. You can also add some loose cuttings of the straw, let's call it straw, and just lay that across the bottom of the feet. But don't do too much of that, because we're going to put another stage of static grass to look like really fine straw. You might be all fingers and thumbs to start with when you're doing this, but you'll soon get the knack. And don't worry about using white glue for this. It will hold. If it's looking as though it's falling over, just push it back up. It will hold it in place to dry and permanently as well. Super glue is okay, but if you cover the whole thing with lots of little bits of super glue, you could get misting, which isn't good. It can be fixed with super glue remover, but it's still a bit of a pain. Go for white glue. So the following day, once again, folks, we're waiting overnight, in this case for the white glue to dry. I'm going to add the static grass I was talking about. I'm going to create little rows as if we've been planting rice. This is a paddy field after all. And I'm going to be reaching those areas that I couldn't get to with the welcome mat type clumps. And incidentally, I've trimmed the welcome mat clumps once they're in place to cut them down a bit. That just helps manage the difficulties of trimming them to size and holding them in place whilst you're gluing them and so on. They don't have to be very tall. It's better if they're not too tall. Anyway, here I am using straw, static grass with a little bit of greenery added in, and just, as you can see, just dropping into those lines, helping to cover area around the figure bases and so on, helping to fill in the blanks where the welcome mat clumps are not positioned. And the final stage of flocking, we don't need to wait till the next day to do this, folks. We can just get stuck straight in. We're going to put a more greener mix of that straw static grass across the top of the banks of the paddy fields. Very simple, as you can see here. We're using the different colour of static grass because it will help give a bit more definition to the shape of the banks, lift them out from the background of the base, so to speak. And that will be the end of an interesting project, though it's not the end of this overall Japanese commission that I'm working through. There's going to be gun teams and there's going to be tanks too, so stay tuned for more tutorials. So as I finish up here, just like to say thanks to everyone for watching. If you've got any questions, stick them in the comments below. If you support the channel by subscribing, then thank you very much, and if you'd like to do so, then you can hit the subscribe button, and if you hit the bell button, that means you can definitely catch up with us on the next one and see what other interesting projects we're working through.